BBC Two? It's better than BBC One. It's more interesting.
Well, I personally don't dislike it. My daughters don't like it because there's not... I mean, they're teenagers, so they don't like watching it. They like watching Top of the Pops and things like that, you know.
I think it's very good because it has lots of concerts and things on it.
All grey whistle test, and that's about all. I'm afraid I'm prejudiced against straight programmes.
I think it's smashing.
I like it best of all the programmes.
Why?
Because it does some things extraordinarily well. War and Peace is one, for instance.
Never watch it.
Why not?
Don't like it. Don't like the programmes.
None of them?
No, none of them. The only ones I like were the old vintage movies.
It's all right, I suppose, when you want to watch, selected programmes. I don't very often watch it, quite frankly.
You want me to be honest, I prefer ITV.
Better than BBC One.
I haven't got it. I can't get it. I haven't got an aerial. I like Alias Smith and Jones and
Oh yeah,
Almost Love and
this
things
is
like
a
that.
we always watch BBC Two on Mondays.
Oh, a better type of programme altogether, on the whole.
I haven't got it. I don't watch it, so I don't know.
I like BBC Two, but I don't like ITV because there's too many adverts in it.
I think it's good to have a more serious network. I watch it quite frequently.
I can't get it very well. I can't. My life I can't. Trouble all the time. I'm in a bad area where I live. What else you want to know?
When you do get it, what do you think of it?
It's quite good. Very intellectual.
The man most closely linked to the development of this apparently intellectual channel is the man to whom we devote the whole of this final lineup. David Attenborough became controller of BBC Two in March 1965. Under his control, BBC Two spread to the regions, pioneered colour, and in January 1969 he was promoted to director of all BBC television programmes. 3 weeks ago, after 4 years at the top, David Attenborough announced that he was giving up that directorship to return to active programme making.
David Attenborough, if we could start where you entered the grey flannel jungle of the sixth floor of the BBC when you took charge of BBC Two. After 8 years, it's still not getting the kind of audiences people hoped it would get, that you certainly hoped it would get. Why not?
I'm not sure that's altogether true. It's certainly true that it's not getting audiences which are as great in numbers as BBC One or ITV. But you see, well, all of us here remember those early days when we were actually trying to make it absolutely clear in our minds what BBC Two was trying to do. And what I think it was that we recognised that BBC One, as the premier national network of the BBC, had to be mainstream. It had to cover the whole spectrum as far as it could. And that what BBC Two then did was to give choice, that to do things which BBC One didn't do. And therefore it had to go out and look for things which, for whatever reason it was, BBC One hadn't the time for or had neglected for some reason or other. So that really what we're talking about is one network which is mainstream and another one which is the supplement, which is the addition, which is the spice, which is the extra bit. And so what viewers, I hoped always would do, would be to live, as it were, most of the time with BBC One and go to BBC Two for those very specialist things which made all the difference. And those people actually on that film had it, I thought, exactly right, exactly what one wanted. Yes, I think it's great, but I only go there for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things a week. Now, if you wanted to make BBC Two get exactly the same audience as BBC One, it wouldn't be any problem. I mean, you would just change the programmes. You would put on the sort of programmes that BBC One is putting on. And what is the point of that? Nothing whatsoever. The point of BBC Two was that it actually enabled you to spread the range of programmes.
Alternatively, since in some minds, as we heard in that box pop, since in some minds it's regarded as a kind of intellectual ghetto, why not go the whole hog and make it an equivalent of Radio 3, say?
Well, I would be very sorry to lose golf. I'd be very sorry to lose Old Grey Whistle Test. I'd be very sorry to lose Rugby League. I'd be very sorry to lose Wheelbase. I'd be very sorry to lose a whole range of things which are minority, but not intellectual minority. Why, as the only minority that we're talking about, necessarily intellectual one? I mean, that seems to me a very sort of intellectually snobbish sort of concept.
But why not give an alternative channel a personality in its own right? As for example, they have done in Sweden, where they've got a two-channel system, in which there is a genuine competition of ideas, although they avoid through careful planning, direct programme conflicts?
I think that you get the best service and the best range of programs to viewers if you recognise that we have two networks here working absolutely hand in glove. You see, the Americans would never believe that you could have one network that was actually truly complementary. They all said, oh, you're bound to be in competition. And when I said, look, can you imagine a network which actually tells people what is being seen on the other network, and if you prefer it, go and have a look? And they said, that could never happen. I said, well, it happens on BBC Two, and it happens on BBC One. And so what BBC One and Two represent is together a careful, unified choice, or should. And so I don't think that we should be so egocentric in a BBC Two sense, and we're all BBC Two men in that sense, as to suppose that we have to be different, and that people who watch us, we don't want to watch any other network. I don't believe that's right.
There's still this powerful feeling, and it seems to be abroad, that even when BBC Two scores notable successes, notable popular successes, as for example in the case of the Forsyte saga, that it remains for the major channel, BBC One, to actually score the real success. BBC Two scores the prestigious successes, and then the concrete successes, if you like, in terms of viewers, are scored on the other channel. Why should this necessarily be so?
Well, Robin Scott, I wish, was here too, because he's the controller of BBC Two now, and he's had as much a hand in the development of BBC Two as I have. But he and I both know, having planned the schedules, that you can't plan the schedules for what's called audience inheritance. That is to say, BBC One and ITV tend to go for the big audience appeal programmes early in the evening, knowing that there are a lot of people who once turn to that will stay with the network to see something else. And that, of course, isn't just a nasty, despicable audience-grubbing ambition, although it can be. It can also be interpreted as a way of getting a very good audience for a serious programme like Panorama. Now, if you decide that BBC Two is going to be planned in a complementary way, it almost automatically follows...
But always as a supplement.
Yes, but also that you make sure that it doesn't show the same sort of programme at the same time as is being shown simultaneously on BBC One. If you plan that, you cannot plan for audience inheritance in that sense. And so that you don't get... There are a whole lot of viewers, and I've been one, just as we all have, who, having turned there, well, you're sitting there, and you just let it go on. You just wait and see what turns up. You are a sort of passive viewer who's dragged along. Now, BBC Two cannot cater for that. I don't believe anybody watches the BBC Two programme, or hardly anybody, as a passive viewer. He makes a deliberate choice, so that 1 million people of an audience on BBC One is not the same as 1 million people on BBC Two.
You seem to be saying that BBC Two has arguably broadened taste, broadened the range of choice. Has it deepened it?
Well, those are mysterious adjectives. It has done things that BBC One hasn't done, and amongst them are things which I dare say you might say were deep. Was Six Wives of Henry VIII deep? Was Civilization deep? Arguably they were. If they are, then it has.
Well, these things not have been done in a one BBC network world.
Well, they weren't done, were they? And they were done by people who sometimes produced BBC One.
Its equivalents were done before BBC Two came along, though. Surely John Reed's programmes.
Civilization?
Well, its equivalents, given the resources available at the time. I mean, John Reed's series of
the resources of BBC Two. And look, I'm also responsible for BBC One, and I'm not knocking BBC One, but what BBC One did and had to do was to recognise that it could be seen by virtually the whole population of the United Kingdom. Now, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, BBC Two could only be seen by a small proportion. So that if, for example, I, as a network controller of BBC Two, had been very clever and somehow fiddled it so that I had got the exclusive rights on the World Cup final or something of that sort and said, ha, 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 I'm not going to let this go on BBC One, that would be absurd. And everybody in the country would rightly be furious. So that the network controller of BBC One, Paul Fox, if there's a big thing like that, he must have it. and BBC Two does not have it. But the mere fact that he has to have all that range of things means that he simply doesn't have space for lots of other things. And what you can then do is to take a risk. You see, everyone looks back at civilization and say now, oh yes, of course, an obvious winner. Forsyte Saga, obvious winner. The fact is, nobody had done it before, and both of those things, at the time, there were plenty of people going around saying, oh, very, very minority stuff, you know.
But why, to put it harshly perhaps, why is there not an experimental programme or a breaking new ground programme every day on BBC Two?
Oh, I don't think we've got enough good ideas to produce that. You see, the whole point about experimental programs, is that on the third time you do it, it is no longer experiment. It's, oh, there it is, slot filling again. I mean, they just go on doing that same old experimental program. No, there have been a lot of innovations in BBC Two, I believe. And I think experiment for its own sake is putting carts before horses. What you're concerned about is good programmes and good new programmes.
And more generally, perhaps, in Lord Reith's day, the BBC had a very distinctive house style, so that a cartoon personification of the BBC might have been a figure upper middle class, donnish, a devout Christian, morally rigid, sexually chaste. Now, if you were asked to describe a cartoon figure of a personification of the BBC as it is today, would you be able to describe it?
Well, yes, I suppose if it was an aunt, it's probably the name round its neck would be Sally. And if it was smiling, it was because of the brickbats which were coming right, left and centre. But at the same time, it would be receiving the brickbats in the actual belief, which is widely felt, as you well know, all over this place, that actually it is not a measure of success of a television network as to how few complaints or how few troubles or how few furores it causes. Indeed, you might say that if you have the guts to tackle certain things, which you should have, you will certainly be causing problems. So that I wouldn't hope ever that we measured our success by how few rows we were causing.
No, I wasn't suggesting that for a moment.
I didn't say you did.
You see, there are so many aspects of our society today that are being questioned, and the BBC itself, as you quite rightly suggested just now, is being questioned, perhaps in ways that it's never been questioned before. And do you think it's possible that as you leave the BBC, you leave a BBC that is itself confused, that it doesn't really know how to react to all sorts of criticisms and pressures? It really doesn't know what attitude it ought to adopt to almost anything.
I think that the difference between the BBC now and the BBC in the 30s, under Lord Reith, can be paralleled very closely between British society now and British society in the 30s. I think in the 30s that you could produce a dozen propositions which you would think almost everybody would agree with. They would agree that Christian marriage is the right basis for a relationship between man and woman. They would agree that drugs were wrong. Capital punishment probably was right. That the empire and owning territories abroad was also right. Drugs would be wrong. Now you can take a whole list of those things, which in the 30s nobody would question. Today, every one of those propositions is seriously questioned, not by far-out fringe groups, but by serious and concerned and intelligent people who have different points of view. Now, our job in the 30s, and I wasn't in the BBC in the 30s, but I suspect in the 30s you could put on programmes which didn't cause a lot of problem because the vast majority of the listening public agreed with them. That's the way you ran things. Now, the vast majority, you can't find a vast majority in the country today who agrees that this is the way you run things on ethical or political or all sorts of areas. So that if we are to do our job, which is to allow those voices to be heard, they're going to infuriate the people who hold the other point of view.
Yes, but if you take these outside pressures, whether they're political or minority groups or whatever, to what extent would you say has the BBC in the last 8.5 years been influenced by them, for good or bad?
The BBC, I don't think, should have an editorial stance. I mean, obviously it should not be either pro-common market or anti-common market. And indeed, if there are significant figures who are saying, making statements about subjects, important subjects, even if they're in the minority, we should put them on. Now, this is actually not a new policy, and just going slightly against what I was saying earlier about the history. I remember, long before I came into the BBC, but I remember a terrific furore, absolute scandal going on because there was a lecturer called Dame Margaret Knight, I remember the name now, who put on the humanist view. And people said, how absolutely scandalous. Archbishops got up and fulminated, and the BBC must be stopped for spreading this poison through society. Well, it's always been like that, and if we actually ignore the Margaret Knights in the 40s, or indeed whoever is her equivalent in the 60s and the 70s, then we're failing.
But where would you say the BBC's responsibility ultimately lies? I mean, does it owe a responsibility to the institutions, the established institutions, or does it really owe its responsibility to the individual viewer?
It owes its responsibility to society.